Good afternoon. I am Eric Cuzuzo, and welcome to Stream of Thoughts, the new public program format of Kingston Festival des Arts. Stream of Thoughts is a program of encounters that accompanies the festival. Due to the pandemic and the growing collective awareness of the issues and disparities affecting different parts of the world, it has become clear that the conversation to be must have a global reach while also considering the various local contexts. Stream of Thoughts acknowledges this by taking place online for free and being accessible both live and via digital archive once the talk is done. With discussions held between speakers in Brussels and elsewhere, far and wide. And although it resonates with different artistic projects within the festival, this discursive program is autonomous, composed of perspectives from the artistic, academic, activist, and literary worlds, in knowledge of the richness created when these disciplines feed off and into one another. This sixth episode will take the form of a conversation between choreographer Amanda Piña and sociologist Rolando Vázquez Melken, tracing the genealogy of the colonial difference, which is present in the conquest dances that inspired Amanda Piña and Rodrigo de la Torre's work presented at the festival this year. Together, they will reflect on how modernity and coloniality meant the establishment of an epistemic and aesthetic territory that goes hand in hand with the expansion of capital and accumulation through dispossession. They will explain how the colonial difference is articulated by politics of time, contemporary versus traditional, an instrumentalization of space, territories and borders, and the classification of bodies through racializations, in ways which reproduce the dominant order and further global injustice. I will be in the chat as Eric Cuzuzo. Please join me there. React to the conversation and ask your questions in the chat during the live stream, and they will be shared with our guests. I now give the floor to Amanda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. Thank you very much, Kingston Festival, for having hosted us today. I'm very happy about this conversation with Rolando. We have been working for a while together, and in this performance that we have brought to Kingston Festival this year, that we were supposed to present last year, but postponed and luckily managed to do it in this weather, Frontera Border, a Living Monument. We have been researching for 1.5 years on dances of conquest, and a conversation started with Rolando about this particular project and in which way the bodies that are at the border are bodies that carry frontiers in themselves. I don't know if you are already showing the pictures because I only see myself on the screen. It would be nice that you change the screen so that we can, yes, thank you. So these are some images of the performance that we just showed, and they are gonna be there somehow to spark a conversation about the many issues that cross the bodies of the performers, the bodies of people at the border or trapped between borders or crossing borders, and the implications of decolonial work and Rolando's decolonial work in establishing a language to talk about these issues and advancing a mode of deep sort of acknowledgement of how Western thought is structured and in which way Western art reproduces some, if it's not aware, some violences within that frame. So I'm very honored to have Rolando here today, and it is always beautiful to continue this conversation with him and with the many people that are part of this project that I could and would like to mention. Juan Carlos Palma from Mexican School of Folkloric Dance, Nicole Heitzinger, dance theorist from the University of Salzburg, and also all the performers with their bodies and with their knowledges, and especially Rodrigo de la Torre, who is the leader of the Danza de Matamoros. I give the word now to Rolando.
Thank you, Amanda.
I don't hear you.
I'm really glad to be here.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now yes.
Would it be possible to put Amanda and myself on the screen, please?
Super.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Amanda. Well, I wish I was there with all of you. I want to thank Eric and the Festival of the Arts, and of course Amanda and Rodrigo, and all the team for the invitation. I will give a short talk about things that we have we have been in conversation for the last few years with Amanda, and so I will not take too long, so that after that we can have an open dialogue. I think Amanda, we can hear the microphone from your side, so there is
Can you
background
mute
noise, but it's okay.
this mic?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, so I will start by one question that Amanda raised in one interview she did for this work with me, and the question was why the colonial works are so much misunderstood, particularly in Western Europe. So we have been seeing how artists that are doing decolonial work are often misunderstood by the critics, but also by the publics and by fellow artists. So this is a very important question because it is a question that leads us to the problem of reception, or what we might call the impossibility of reception across the colonial difference. So why is it that the colonial works cannot be read by the Western publics and the Western critics, or people that have been formed in the modern colonial system? So I will speak about that, and then I will go towards what the colonial aesthesis is about. Well, as you possibly know, the colonial thinking thinks that we live in a modern colonial order, that there is no modernity without coloniality, and that the fact that there is no modernity without coloniality implies that there is a big border that we call the colonial difference, the difference between those that are privileged, those that are in the now of history, in the now of contemporaneity, and those that are excluded from it by the modern colonial system. And this border, very importantly, is a border that is not just political, it is not just about colonization, but it's about coloniality. It's about a continuous condition that is expressing itself, yes, through politics and through the economy, through capitalism, but also for us, very importantly, through knowledge and aesthetics. So through epistemology and through aesthetics. So the colonial difference, then, we would argue, is constituted by an epistemic and an aesthetic border that, on the one side, creates a territory, the territory of the epistemic territory of modernity, the aesthetic territory of modernity, and excludes other people, other worlds of meaning and sensing from that territory. So you have here two problems. One is the problem of reception, that is how the publics and the critics and the institutions that are, let's say, the normative institutions of the West, belong to the main, or to this territoriality of modernity, this epistemic and aesthetic territory that not only constitutes them, but that they also enforce. And in this way, we say they are living in an enclosure. They are incapable of understanding anything that is outside their epistemic and aesthetic territory. So when, for example, in the work of Amanda, when dances that come from different genealogies that don't belong to the genealogies of the West are presented, they are immediately seen as non-contemporary or as traditional, as exotic, etc. But they are not seen as challenging the contemporary. So the colonial aesthesis is a call, on the one hand, to say, well, we need to challenge that boundary. And it is a call for what we call the end of the contemporary, because the contemporary has performed this role of enforcing the epistemic and aesthetic territoriality of modernity. It performs a role of validation. So, what is contemporary and what is not contemporary? So, we have on that side the enclosure of perception. Very concretely, the institutions, the publics, come with a framework that we call, for example, the white gaze. They can only see through some eyes. They can only understand and sense through some forms of embodiment and some forms of rationality. And whenever they are challenged beyond that, they cannot see it. They cannot understand it. So here are very important questions for us that come after this. First, the question of with whose eyes are we seeing? Who is forming our eyes? Who is forming our forms of perception? And here, of course, there is an important history that of Western institutions that have been constituting subjects with particular ways of seeing, particular eyes. And in connection to the work of Amanda, for example, we see also that we should ask, particularly in relation to dance, with which bodies are we made to sense and to perceive the world and to inhabit the world? So who is determining this way in which we embody ourselves? And the history of the body as individual body is also a history of Western subjectivity, subjectivation, etc. So within the dominant grammars of modernity, let's say the somatic grammars of modernity, the representational grammars of modernity, there is no voice, no place, no validity for all those aestheses that don't belong to its paradigm. And here is whether the decolonial means a coming to voice. The decolonial is challenging this silencing. And it is a way in which we can say that decolonial dancers today are performing a somatic on-silencing. They are bringing grammars of the body, memories of the body that have been dismissed by the canon of dancing and by the formation of the modern individualized body. In this bringing other forms of aesthesis, they are bringing other notions of embodiment. For example, bodies that are territory, bodies that are earth bodies, bodies that are memorial bodies. And I think this is the frontiers that Amanda is bringing us towards in her work, and that are very important to challenge the paradigm of Western modernity that is based on anthropocentrism, on the separation of the human from earth, and on Eurocentrism, the separation of modernity from other worlds of meaning, of Western modernity from other worlds of meaning. So decoloniality means then an epistemic and an aesthetic shift. It implies overcoming the epistemic framework of modernity and the aesthetic framework of modernity. And here, when we speak of aesthetics, we're not just speaking of overcoming the canon of aesthetics like in the high arts. We are also speaking of challenging the control of perception that modernity exercises over people in the world. So who controls how we perceive the world? Who controls the representation of the world? And who controls our experience of the world or of the real? So challenging modern aesthetics is also about opening towards plural ways of understanding, towards pluriversality in its epistemology, so towards multiple ways of understanding the world. A world where many worlds can fit, like the Zapatista philosophy teaches. And it is also about transforming our forms of sensing, perception, not by inventing new forms of perception, but by remembering, by bringing back together, so membering back all those forms of perception that have been dismembered by the violence and the silencing of coloniality. So I will finish this brief introduction by saying that for us the big challenge that presents itself when we are addressing decoloniality and the decolonization of epistemology and aesthetics is a paradigm shift or a change of epoch. So when we see the end of the contemporary, the end of the Western project of modernity as a dominant project in the world, and the opening towards pluriversality. And this shift implies not just this statement of shifting from the normative universality or the normative contemporaneity of modernity towards pluriversality, but it implies a change in orientation towards the world. From the primacy of representation and enunciation, that is what our cultural and academic institutions teach us to be, and also consumption teaches to be that, the capitalist subject, that is, subjects that have the power of appropriating the world and of representing the world, consuming the world and enunciating the world. We need to shift from that paradigm where the primacy is centered on consumption and the enunciation of the world, so designing the world as an object of the human, towards a paradigm of reception, of listening, of relationality. I will finish there to start the conversation with Amanda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rolando. I am very happy that you mentioned the idea of remembering a body of knowledge, a body of experience that has been dismembered, which is very important for me in this project of allowing or creating the conditions for the reappearance of ancestral forms of movement. In that reappearance, that enabling, that listening to what the work wants and what the collective somehow is managing in the artistic work is very important for me, and I think it's very well described when you say that. I would like to bring somehow the conversation into from what we are talking about, aesthesia, which is absolutely political as well, to more concrete topics like the history of the dance and the lineage of the dance in Matamoros, and bringing the dance into Fortress Europe, bringing all these people and allowing this dance to exist in this central place, which the curators in Kunsten have allow us to take, which is somehow for me part of a historical movement. And when I feel that we are somehow a historical and collective movement, the work has much more sense, right? So if we are part of a weaving in which all the different designs are important, but they create a tapestry in which we are bringing front and we are bringing forward this pluriversality that you speak, and also the perspectives which are somehow the collateral damage of capitalism, but that you mentioned in your text that you wrote for the publication that we are preparing about this volume of endangered human movements. They are not collateral damage, they constitute capitalism and what we call neoliberalism, right? So I would love you to talk a bit about that.
Thank you. Yes, well, I would like to add two small things. One is when you speak first about the reappearance of ancestral forms of movement, I want here to clarify for this festival that what we mean by ancestrality, right? Because often ancestrality is understood in the West as something mystical, as something out of the real, as a fiction, a sort
Exactly,
of
like
fiction.
something transcendent, yeah.
Yeah, as a sort of primitive fiction. And for us, it's very important to show that ancestrality is actually challenging the Western politics of time, because the politics of time in the West have been produced in a way in which there is a past that is gone, that is fixed, that is reified, that is turned into an object, into an archive, into a monument, and a present that is only a surface, only the surface of the now, and a future that is always to come. This will be the general understanding of temporality in modernity. And this temporality doesn't understand the ancestral because they don't see a past that is not fixed, that is not gone, that is not dead. And why is this? Well, in our work, we challenge one of the master dichotomies of European philosophy, that is the dichotomy between immanence and transcendence, meaning that on the one hand, there's a philosophies of transcendence that come from theology, that go towards a god or a superhuman or an absolute oneness, a monad, or the philosophies of immanence that are very much trendy today with new materialism, for example, where everything is in the surface of the present and everything is just a collection of things in the now. And what we are saying here is that ancestrality is neither immanence nor transcendence, because ancestrality is not some transcendental God somewhere outside reality or a utopia in the future. And ancestrality is also not in immanence. It's not just something in the materiality of space. So for this, we use the term, we say in our work that ancestrality is actually in the mode of precedence. That is a mode of time, a mode of being in time that is memorial, that acknowledges that we all come from people before us, and that people before us has constructed the world in which we live. That's the paths in which we walk, the language we speak, and the absence of that relation to memory is what makes modernity an amnesic condition, and a condition that is always in the anxiety of the new and desire, etc. So when you say ancestral forms of movement, reappearance of ancestral forms of movement, you are engaging a politics of time that is precedential, that is recognizing the forms of movement, the forms of embodiment that have been silenced, that have been forgotten, that have been erased, that have been displaced out of history, that have been displaced out of the present by the dominant paradigm. And in that sense, it is a movement for justice. It is a form of justice. And that's why for us it's very important, the ancestral or the precedential, because it is what allows to bring justice and ethics into the world. Right? When you're just thinking in terms of futurity, you don't understand what is calling for justice. That is the colonial wound. And people that have been living under colonialism or under coloniality or under the coloniality of gender, or racialized, experience vividly the colonial wound, a wound that remains open, that is in their bodies, and that is not just their wound, but is an ancestral wound, or philosophically speaking, a precedential wound, something that is called for healing. So the task of healing, it is a task for justice that the decolonial engages with. So listening and making possible the reappearance of ancestral forms of movement is very different from inventing new movements, inventing a new abstraction, a new type of movement that nobody has done before, so that it can be contemporary, right? So remembering ancestral movements is actually undoing the colonial difference that has been instituted precisely by that trend of contemporaneity that is impermeable to remembering, that is only in this power of determining the present and its futurity. So that's one side. The second side of what you are asking me about the dance of the Matamoros, for me was very important work to engage with, because it is a work that embodies and that comes directly from embodied experience of the border, the US-Mexico border that, as you quote in your work, and Saldúa wrote about. That is one of the borders where the inequalities of the world are alive, and where the most extreme brutality of capitalism happens, where there is a capitalism without regulation, a capitalism that is violent, that is where the search for profit produces direct violence and death, and where being able to survive requires to be under those conditions. So that forms of dance emerge under those conditions, and that they are remembering ancestral roots of the Mesoamerican dances is a very important act of resistance under these extreme conditions of becoming the subjects and being subjected to the violence of capitalism as an everyday life experience. Particularly, in this case, masculinities that are forced into violence in order to survive, in order to be someone, And so this extreme form of capitalism that we see in the Mexico-US border, and particularly with the drug cartels controlling the forms of socialization, is something that, let's say, doesn't allow for much space to become other. And these dances show that there is possibilities to remembering, to hold on to certain notion of who we are, and of certain notion of being in some place, which is something that is, for me, unlike most contemporary dance, that is about it being in a no place, being in the black box. So the dance of Matamoros is clearly a dance that is, for me in my reading, and I think I'm also following Nicole's, it is a dance that expresses a relation to place, a relation to being somewhere, with its stepping on the ground, that is very unlike the move to abstraction of the tradition of modern and contemporary dance. And this being somewhere in the ground is very important of all Mesoamerican philosophies that are relational with the earth. So the dance, in my understanding, many of these traditions of dance, let's say of the Mesoamerican dances, are not about the representation, the primacy of representation of how it looks like for the public, but they're about the creation of the communal, the remembering in the body, the relation to earth through the movements. They are about this experience, this weaving of temporalities that is not necessarily for show or for representation, although they might be represented, but that is not their nucleus, I would say.
Totally. And there is a word in Nahuatl language which is Ixiplatl, which it means to be the one who invokes or the one who makes present in the flesh an entity, somebody, something, which is very radically different than representation in the Western sense, I think. And for me, that invocation or that allowing entities to emerge is very important in this type of work, and is something that is not controlled or directed, but is something that actually, as a maker or as somebody leading a project with many artists, it is a work of listening, right? And having the patience to understand how it's manifested. I think that idea of representation has been limited also, and it has limited dance as a form of expression. While I think dance, especially while dancing, it allows a form of thinking to emerge, a sense thinking, which is highly synthetic, which unites and which creates a union, a sort of understanding of relation. So I would like to make this distinction of dance as a form of expression or as a spectacle, and to think of dance and danzas, and maybe especially dances like dances that happen outside of this canon of representation, this canon of visibility. What you say, that the visual is so premier and is so like hierarchically over other forms of other senses. That dance is actually a technology, an ancient technology that allows us to listen to the whole and be part of the whole. And that form of thinking or of sense thinking is ancestral and is so needed today. So for me, the Danza de Matamoros and the dancers of Matamoros, what they do is that, because they are so large in number, right? There are 40 drummers and 40 dancers that are creating this communal and collective experience. I wanted to also to sort of defend dance in those terms, right? I think it's super important for today, because we know where we have come now with this idea of understanding through separation, what you name the abstraction of the theater, the abstraction of the museum, somehow goes in line with the idea of knowing that is present in Western epistemics, right? Which is a form of knowing that acts through separation from relations. Right, and I think dance can do the opposite.
Yes. Yes. Well, let me pick it from there. Yes. Well, as you know, in our thinking, we think that the condition of the modern subject is the condition of separation, right? So it is not really a great thing, because the modern subject is humanized by being separated from the earth, by being separated from community, from the communal, and by being separated from time, including the ancestral, from remembering, right? Mm-hmm. So this is one of the biggest challenges, how to undo those separations and how to come into relation, right? How to recover relational forms of living that I think are common to most First Nations and indigenous and maroon societies. The relational is not an invention of any philosopher. It is a practice that Western modernity and globalization has systematically destroyed. I think a very important phrase of Arturo Escobar, well, a phrase I like a lot, is where he says several times in several of his works that globalization has taken place at the expense of relational walls. So, of course, the resistance to this capitalist globalization, to these individuals as separated, as isolated, is to relate back, right? And this relating back implies a transformation of everything we do, basically. And so when you're speaking of the Ishipatul as an invocation, as allowing through the flesh an invocation, it is, for me, it's fundamental to see that it is marking this completely different movement than the movement of modernity, than the movement of representation, as you were saying, because this idea of invocation is about entering into relation through time, allowing, using, let's say, using the body or leaving the body, dancing the body into relation, right? And or the relation dancing the body, right? So allowing the relational to move the body into dance. And this logic of entering into the relation is what I was connects to what I was speaking at the beginning. That is a movement of reception. So how can we humble the modern subject in order for the modern subject to become capable of receiving the other, right? Of remembering, I say the task of remembering ourselves, which is not a psychological individual memory, but it's the capacity of remembering Earth, remembering the communal, and remembering others. So how can we abandon that individualized subjectivity and move towards a capacious way of living in the world, a way of living in the world in which we can receive the plurality of the other without reducing it to myself. Actually, by receiving it, it is transforming me. So the invocation transforms you. You stop being only yourself through it. It is not something you are acquiring to fortify or to make yourself more individual, you know. And here, I think one of the ways in which I express it in my writing is this: how decoloniality here will mean a movement from owning, so the movement of ownership of, let's say, capitalism, but also of subjectivity, from owning to owing, to becoming, to entering a mode of gratitude, of recognizing that we are all made through the life of Earth and the life of others, and that we have to have that relation of gratitude, that stewardship towards the earth instead of that ownership, for example. So for me, moving from owning to owing is what, for example, a dance of invocation should be about. You know, it is a way of receiving for offering. It is not a way of appropriation for enunciating. And so these are very different attitudes towards the world. Right?
And in very different relation to power, right? In the mode of dance as a form of offering, the power, it is in the communal, and the communal is not even the choreography. What we are doing together is an act of love, because we are lending our bodies to those who are in much difficult conditions, and also we are remembering our own experiences with borders, right? The cast, I mean, the crew is, we all have a different experience with what it means to cross, what it means to have different relations that somehow surpass binary logics of nationality. You know, you are allowed to have one nationality, right? You have to allow to be one thing. And I think this type of work really remembers that we can be many, and that we are actually ancestral literally, right? Because we are all the ones that we have been. And when I look at my hands, I look at the hands of the ones who have lent me these hands. And I am grateful for having this life force that allows me to be here with you conversing. So this gratitude has to do with understanding that life is not like a status quo, but actually I think it is somehow the opposite, like a sort of a miracle, and maybe death would be the status quo. So in relation to healing, I think I've learned, for example, from Maracame Catira, that we know from the Wirrárica community in Mexico, that we don't heal because we are sick. We heal because we cherish life, because we want to reproduce life, help life to find its ways in our bodies and in our collectivities. So in that sense, I also think of dance as a form of healing too. No needing sickness to exist, right? But as a practice of bringing into life, bringing into liveness. This is, I think, something that I am very committed to in the work we do with dancers and with indigenous communities. And in this context, we have opened together for different forms of knowing to enter in dialogue without the usual hierarchies between them, like in the School of the Jaguar that we did together in Antwerp and Leuven and Vienna.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Amanda. Well, of course, we are in complete agreement with this idea that we are the ones who we have been. And that is why I think one of the most difficult questions is the one I mentioned before, that is the task of remembering ourselves. Because the condition of being separated is a condition of forgetfulness, of amnesia. It's an amnesic condition. So how can we remember ourselves, right? And when you see your hands and you see the hands of those who precede you, but it is the same. If you see the minerals in your body, the mountain is there, right? It's there is nothing in our
right?
body that is. Yes, there is nothing in our body that doesn't come from the earth, right? So the absurdity of this paradigm that separates the human from earth is incredible, right? And then it is a paradigm that will say the more you transform and consume the earth, the more you exploit the earth, the more civilized you are, right? Whereas First Nations all over the world are saying, well, that's completely absurd. They have been saying that for 500 years. How can you be more the more you destroy where you come from, right? And what sustains the conditions of your life. So this is the arrogance of the idea of the human and of the modern subject, that the moment we remember ourselves, we cannot continue doing this, right? So it is what we call a type of arrogant ignorance that sustains the functioning of the whole system. You know? So the system depends on us forgetting that we are consuming the life of others and the life of Earth. So often in my classes and in my talks, I speak of the plantation system as one of the moments in which you see the development of the modern colonial system in a very concrete example, an example in which the enslavement of others and the destruction of ecological spaces, of environments to create monocultures came together. So the consumption of the life of Earth and the consumption of the life of others came together to produce the global commodity, the coffee, the sugar, etc. Right? And to produce the body of the consumer, the white body, the body that will be constructed through the consumption of the life of others and life of Earth, a body that we are also ourselves. So for me, it's very important to overcome that false innocence, that we are not implicated in the destruction of Earth and the destruction of others. Because if we see at our clothes, at our ways of eating, at our forms of life, we will discover very soon that we are actually very implicated in the colonial difference, in the colonial violence that is ongoing. That we might say, well, the plantation that was based on slavery was unacceptable, but we are living in a very similar system, right? And well, the other thing I want to to say is when you are saying that lending our bodies is an act of love, I think that is enormously important. This notion of love as not the individual love, not the, let's say, the romantic love of loving one person as something I have or I want to have, but the love of, let's say, in many spiritual traditions, they will speak of the big love, not the small love, but the big love. And the big love is precisely that entering in relation, that offering oneself for that offering our breath, our living energy for the expression and the flourishment of those things that have been silenced, that have been suppressed, those life worlds that have been displaced to non-existence, to silence, to oblivion, under very very pressing and very harsh circumstances. So we are speaking often of histories of genocide, of racialization, of mass exploitation. So the disappearance of the Mesoamerican and the civilizations of the whole of Abya Yala is testimony to the enormous colonial violence that in a way we are inheritors of, and that we need to respond to, that it is calling for justice, it is calling for healing, And the colonial aesthesis is about that, it's about engaging in that task of justice, that task of healing. That's why, today, particularly in Europe, the decolonial has become a very big fashion, and everybody is speaking out the word decolonial. Everybody says decolonial this, decolonial that. But unfortunately, not everybody is engaging in a decolonial doing, an ethics, a politics that is decolonial.
As a
they
practice,
might speak
right?
the word, yes, as a practice. So they might speak the word, but they don't practice it. And one of the things that is very key for us is to say, well, not every critique is decolonial. It's good to do critical thinking. It's good to do deconstruction. It's good to do contemporary whatever. That's fine, but that doesn't mean it's decolonial. The decolonial is what is engaging with the colonial difference, right? It's engaging with the colonial wound, and it's not just reproducing the colonial wound by saying now we are decolonial. No, it is engaging in undoing the colonial wound, in healing the colonial wound. So the task of decolonizing aesthetics, decolonizing Western epistemology, is to liberate aesthesis, to liberate other forms of being and sensing in the world, and liberate in the sense of giving dignity, of giving voice, of offering the space of reception. So when you are saying this is an act of love, this is a point about receiving this call, and in what we have been calling the mode of listening. A practice that is in the mode of listening is not a practice that is in the mode of enunciation of the I think this, I say that, but it's about, yes, I'm performing this dance, but this dance is a reappearance, is the way of an invocation, is an offering, and which is very different from I'm enunciating, I'm performing. This trend in the West in the last 20 years with identity politics, and also some sorts of performativity that have to do with the privilege of being oneself, and without realizing that many people in the world, particularly under colonial conditions, don't have this privilege. So instead of the performativity of the I, we call for positionality. We need to recognize where each one of us is positioned in order to be able to act ethically and to to engage in the task of healing. And we also say, well, not everybody has to be decolonial, you know, it is not a universal recipe. It is for those that feel called to do that, you know. If people want to do just a internal critique of capital or of modernity or of the state, that's fine, and we also need it, you know. It's not that the decolonial is the only option, you know. That's why we call it the decolonial option, because we think it is not a universal, it is an option of acting and engaging that also enables the articulation between many other struggles and many other people that are engaging in this.
Totally. I was while you were talking, I was thinking shortly about the structure of this work, Frontera Border Living Monument, which somehow doesn't allow the performers, and we discussed it with Juan Carlos, I think last night, that at the moment that you are performing like individual, you are out of tune, it doesn't work. So it only works if you are lending your body, your presence to this reappearance, but as a collective. So it's a very kind of thin line that we can move and that we have learned through the work, like in the way the work emerges. And yesterday we were counting that there are 46 figures that have appeared in the piece, that that they appeared not by me creating them, but they were invoked, they appeared. Like the woman who is being raped in the border, El Mojado, the one who crossed, La Muerte, the death, the Palestinian insurgents. Like there are many figures that are appearing in this work about borders and about bodies at borders, we have been witness their appearance, and that they don't appear in a mode of now we are going to improvise, but they appear in another way. And I think that is so interesting to acknowledge that what we are doing is really opening also what the field is and can be to other modes that have been there but that have been silenced, that have been disregarded, other modes of performativity, other ways of collective action. And for me, the knowledge of the performers is absolutely important. So actually when you're talking about arrogance and ignorance, I think we enact that rhizomatically through our way of thinking. No, if we think, for example, that this camera is made by men, it is not. It is only changed. All its elements come from the earth. They come from a mountain, right? they are only changed by people. In the same way, like a work of art cannot be made by me, but is already there. It's only changed or kind of modeled. And in the case of, I think, Frontera Border is beautifully shared in a way. Even though I had come to sign this piece, like if you look at the credits, all the elements of the piece are very much, the positionality of the performance is so important. They are the messenger and the message. And I think when you talk about positionality, I can somehow relate to that in the way the piece unfolds, which is somehow different, right? Yesterday we had students and they were like, how this is happening? I was like, yeah, people, is our work. Because we are also the ones who carry the borders, right? In different measures, like maybe Juan Carlos, and we have experienced Juan Carlos, Rodrigo, the drummer, Julio Cesar, a bit more, right? It was quite difficult to bring them into Fortress Europe. We needed to make a lot of phone calls in every one situation. And if I think about what it means to live in Matamoros, Tamaulipas, in that stripe, right? Because the border usually is think of as a line, but in the experience of the people living at the border is more like a wide stripe in which capital acts in ways that are super brutal, like maquila industry, like cheap labor industry, narco violence, right? And in the same way, like people think modernity is great. We have to you have to develop. You third country need development, but coloniality is like a collateral damage. In the same way as you write in your text for the program, this border represents the deregulated capital, neoliberal capital as its best, and narco culture and narco business is that, right? So for me, we have to undo so many thoughts that are sort of wrong or presuppositions, like the one I tell you, like things are made by people. No, they are only changed. Everything comes from somewhere and is made out of earth, right? Out of water. I think that is important to mention. I think that this is very, like, it has changed the way I see things also.
Yes. Maybe I would like to ask you something, Amanda. And it has to do with, when we speak about listening as a verb, the verbality of listening as an action, as a verb. We are always trying to understand better what are the conditions for listening. So on the one hand, we speak, the humbling of modernity, right? Recognizing that we are not that fiction we are told we are. The unlearning of the epistemic and aesthetic frameworks. In a way, and this is where I would like to ask you, for me, listening also implies this, what I call this becoming capacious. And becoming capacious, I mean, if you think of a pot, right? Like a terracotta pot, it is capacious because it is whole inside, right? It has this capacity to receive. Or if you think of the womb,
Yeah.
it
To
has
withhold,
capacity of reception. Yeah. Yes. And so for me, that is the capacity of listening, that you're not determining what is inside, but you are allowing the space for reception. This is what makes us more than what we are through listening, instead of the logic of enunciation that is so central to modern colonial aesthetics and epistemology. So in this, it is in this opening where suddenly, and you're already mentioning it, you experience this radical encounter with the other, right? The other that you have not seen before, because you were talking about the world, designing the world. Suddenly, when you begin listening, you receive figures, histories, memories that you could not have been aware of if you had not become capacious, let's say, if you have not become able to listen beyond your framework of understanding, beyond your academic training or choreographic training or whatever it is. So it is recognizing the radical plurality of the world as a living reality, and not against the notion of the reduction of plurality, the imposition of universality. So my question is, Amanda, what do you think in this work that you are doing is generating this capacity to hold, this capacity to listen and to receive suddenly experiences that I think are not individual experiences, are communal experiences, like the experience of feminicide and the mass rape of women in Mexico and killing, the experience of suffering, of really crossing as a mojado and leaving your land, having to become other to survive in that sense, the experience of imminent death. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think has enabled that possibility, of connecting to things that were not in your design or in your plan? As if you, let's say, I would imagine a modern choreographer or contemporary choreographer is designing the experience, is designing each step. And here you are beginning to say, well, no, things are happening, as we become communal. But so maybe if you could talk a little bit to that.
I have to say that I owe that very much to the encounter with indigenous people I've worked with from different contexts, and lately the one that we know, both of us, Maracame Katira, because in his way of being, and I think we Rarica people are very, very good at that. He's desujetado, he's dissubjected, his presence is not stiff, but his presence is loose, open, and it's something that I've been learning to do in the work, which has to do with humility, with being humble. Not by being an artist, believe that suddenly you are important or personal importance, which will stiff your presence and which would not allow this looseness that can listen. So I've learned a lot from that mode of being, and I also think that what allows that in this work and in this particular process is the fact that we think of the project as a homage to all those who have the power and the resilience and the determination to cross, leave places behind, borders, being them like geographically, aesthetical, social, cultural, etc. So as a homage, it's very much works like an offering, because in the moment that you bring those people at the center and those experiences at the center, and you want to make a homage to them, which are normally seen as unneeded, like collateral damage, they're coming, the migrants, how poor they are, or, and never recognizing their strength and in their determination, in their value, and in the value of their bodies and of their experiences and the knowledge that experience carries, knowledge of being in the body, of being in the flesh, being with others. I think that allows the process to be loosened enough, and that everybody that participates has not a personal importance that would block this way of invocation. That would be my answer. And I'm getting some signs that we should approach the end, but I thought Eric would talk about questions. Okay. So
let me say just quickly something, and then we open for the questions. Because this is a question also, maybe just to finish, that when you speak of Maracame Katira teaching you about being loose and open, this being desubjetivado, desubjectivized, right? It is in contrast, radical contrast with the becoming a monument, of the individual or of the performing individual in social media, for example. That everybody is constructing its own individual monumentality, So, and it brings me also the connection to the colonial feminism and Maria Lugones' statement that we need to move towards a porous body, a body that it can be multiple, that can be many, and instead of an impermeable body, an isolated body. So the body that is in relation is necessarily not an impermeable body, it's necessarily not one, but it becomes plural, it becomes open to others, right? And so my question was, because I saw in the photos that you perform these monuments, and I see this contrast between the becoming open with the becoming monument. So how are you understanding these monuments that I suppose are very different from the imperial monuments of the cities, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, in a way they are melting, and there are three monuments there is the conquistador, the missionary, the mojado, and they are somehow all like very patriarchal constructions, right? All three are somehow in connection. And the fact that they are melting, so that they are getting loose, that they are getting sort of diffuse, is a statement about how historically we are transiting from a place in which we have learned to reproduce a certain structure of power into a melting of that power into more rhizomatic, more relational, and also more solidarious ways of being. And I think that's the message. At the end, we have the last monument. It is a quote to las tesis, the Chilean activists that created El violador eres tú. So I think I understand the monument as something that is sort of reproducing and restating and recreating this power structure, which is somehow melting in a way, which is radically shifting. If we see what's happening in Chile now, for example, there is some hope on that. We have 3 minutes, so we would need to close.
Yes.
And
so we can go for the questions.
I don't know if there are questions. There are no questions. Very much clarity.
Okay.
So I would like to thank you, Rolando, to accompany me, and also thank Kunstfestival des Arts for hosting this Escuela de Fronteras, where we talk about the issues of borders and the issues of bodies who carry borders. And I'm very happy that we are into this conversation, and that this conversation continues in the future, and that we get to also public some of these reflections quite soon on Endangered Human Movements Volume 4, Danza y Frontera. I hope we can manage that.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you to all. Bye-bye.